All right, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. My name's Darryl Budge. I'm the Family Voice State Director here in Western Australia. And we're having a great live discussion today with John Steenhof from the Human Rights Law Alliance, who's going to be speaking today about the particular debates and negotiations going on within the government right now. There's 4 moderate MPs in the Liberal Party that have proposed some changes to the Sex Discrimination Act. And we'll see what happens with those negotiations. But for now, me and John just want to chat about the effect of those things if those amendments were made and what does it mean for Christian schools and religious schools in general. So thanks for joining me today, John. Let's get started. Well, first of all, we know that there's been some backroom deals that have happened here. And I'll just mention those 4 moderate MPs are Angie Bell, Katie Allen, Fiona Martin and Dave Sharma, which would provide some numbers, and they would basically enable this amendment to be moved through in the lower house, and then we'd see that they're going to say we'll supply our vote for passing it through. But what I've just heard today is we've only got 20 minutes left for discussion today.
Okay, right, very good. Well, you can add to that list of MPs, I believe, Warren Entsch and Trent Zimmerman, who've said they're withholding their consent to the bill on the same terms, haven't been as convinced. And also what should be put out there is that this has been a bit of a moving feast. There were articles in the newspaper, in the Guardian and the Australian saying this was happening. And then my latest information is the Attorney General has said it's not happening, although it seems to have been the subject of discussion. And when they say it's not happening, it means it may not be happening exactly as it said in the newspaper, but it's happening. So
it's happening. So explain to me this particular amendment and what do you think it will mean for religious schools?
Well, it comes in the context of the government trying to introduce the Religious Discrimination Bill. It's a very unremarkable bill that's going to give religious belief and activity the same protections of a whole bunch of other attributes that are already protected at law. However, all of the commentary and all of the opposition has been completely and utterly preoccupied, one could say monomaniacally preoccupied, with not how will this bill protect the people it's designed for, but what scaremongering can we do about what it's going to do for homosexuals or what unintended consequences there might be. And the big line is schools are going to be able to fire gay teachers, schools are going to be able to expel gay students. That's a real threat to the trans community, etc. And that has largely been coming not from the crossbench and not from the ALP, but from within the government, from the so-called moderate liberals or the new liberals. And they have been furiously advocating against government policy on this and publicly stating their concerns about it. And the last news was that they had agreed to amendments to the Sex Discrimination Act, because it is the Sex Discrimination Act that talks about discrimination on the basis of sexuality or gender identity. And what apparently has been agreed is that there is a provision in that act which protects Christian schools, and they're going to remove that. Now, that provision says that Christian schools are exempt from the discrimination provisions in the Sex Discrimination Act, meaning that it protects them and shields them from activists who will take claims to try to get extreme transgender and sexual ideology into Christian schools. So that's been a great shield up until now, but it's always been the subject of these unexpected pre-Christmas attacks. You remember Penny Wong tried to remove these provisions in Christmas 2018, and that was unsuccessful. 3 years later, we're back at it again, except this time it is our very own Liberal government which is trying to push through these changes. Now, on its face, it would seem to say that we're going to change the law in a way that most people wouldn't object to. Namely, we're going to remove the ability of Christian schools to reject enrollments or expel vulnerable students. But when you get rid of those protections, it gets rid of not only the ability to control your own enrollment, it also gets rid of your ability to run your school in accordance with your religious convictions. So having had a look at what is being proposed, it suggests to me that schools will be completely at risk to activist opposition and activist litigation if they, say, refuse to allow children to engage in LGBT activism, if they adopt a cautious wait and see approach to a student who wants to gender transition, or who wants to wear a different uniform, or who wants to do something not in accordance with the presentation standards of the school. If they refuse to allow hostile LGBT advocates to run the wellbeing program at the school, that could be complained about if these protections are removed. If they accept a child self-identifying as a gender that they consider themselves to be, which is completely in opposition to their natal sex, and if they treat them in any way different, that is, if they say you can't use the same bathrooms, you can't participate in sports teams, you can't use the uniform, school trips, etc. And of course, if they limit the expression of any same-sex attraction or gender confusion at the school, this is going to open them up to activist pursuit. And it was really going to challenge the fundamental heart and soul of Christian schools and religious schools, which seek to be a place of shelter away from the preoccupation of the rest of society with sexuality, with issues of transgenderism, and allow schools to be places where children are taught and formed without that pressure being put on them at a very young age in the way it's done in state schools. So that's the real danger of this suddenly announced and not consulted proposal and backroom deal that's been hashed out and which has been announced in the newspapers today.
Yeah, and we're seeing a situation where religious groups, Christian Schools Australia, Mark Spencer, ACL, and ourselves, we're very reluctant to support a bill now that it involves this much attack on the freedom of religious schools. I mean, obviously, it's going to dramatically change. The example that Jerome brings up here, can you see a situation where a boy who thinks he's a girl will be able to enroll at an all-girls school, and the school, particularly a religious school, will not be able to do anything about it? So what do you
Absolutely.
say?
That's exactly what these laws are targeting. The people who are asking for them aren't students. No students have put up their hand and said we're being treated appallingly. It's activists who are looking for this. It's backbench Liberal members who just parrot the talking points of hostile anti-religious advocates like Equality Australia, who are asking for this, and that's what they want. They want the ability for students who are gender confused to force an aggressive transgender ideology on schools, which would rather follow biology and science rather than what is largely a new and dangerous set of ideas that's infiltrated all of the public schools.
Yeah. So we have some good things that are happening in this religious discrimination bill. Let's go through some of those things. What are your top points about what the bill does do that is good and beneficial?
Okay, so a religious discrimination bill is going to give protection for people of faith against religious discrimination. That is unfair treatment based simply on their religion. And that could be, will be particularly good in New South Wales and South Australia, which don't have state protections. At the moment, you could put up a sign in a store in New South Wales that says, we don't want to serve any Christians, any Muslims, any Buddhists, get out. And that's perfectly legal. So this bill is going to give Christians who are treated unfairly a way of taking a claim where they have been treated unfairly. And so that is a good change, and it's something that people in New South Wales haven't had. And there are many cases of people who we've dealt with who would have had a claim, but for the fact that every other attribute is protected attribute is protected in federal law, but not religious activity. So we've had people kicked out of cafes for reading their Bible and doing devotions together. We've had a security guard who shared his faith on his break time and was terminated by his employer. They didn't have any legal way of challenging that before. Now they would if we got a religious discrimination bill.
Yeah,
it's going to give some limited protection to people like Archbishop Porteous, who was sued by an activist for being a Catholic who told other Catholics what Catholic doctrine was on marriage. So it'll really shut down a little bit of that activist, the weapons that activists have in Tasmania. Doesn't give a lot of protection to statements of belief. There's been a lot of complaints about that. Most of that is scaremongering and just, quite frankly, ridiculous.
It's a sharply limited clause on protecting statements of belief. In fact, in terms of, it goes much broader than the Folau clause, because Folau clause only tackled out of hours comments for particular people employed by very large organisations like Folau. But in terms of what the statements of belief protection is, it's only in good faith, as long as it's not malicious, as long as it doesn't threaten, intimidate, harass, or vilify a person or group of persons. So
then that protection is further limited by the narrow class of actions that applies to. So it's not going to protect you in your workplace. You'll still be able to be disciplined and lose your job under a code of conduct if you say something your employer doesn't like. You'll have absolutely no recourse against someone, even if you said something reasonable. So we had someone in New South Wales who went into a meeting of an executive team that he was part of. They were making fun of Israel Folau, saying that he was an idiot and he was getting what he deserved. This guy said, look, you know what? You should be careful, because we're a government department. We shouldn't be expressing political views on these things. And I happen to have some sympathy for Israel Folau. People around that table complained about him to HR, said that they felt victimized by what he had said, and tried to get him fired. Now, we helped him to keep his job, but if he'd lost his job, he would have had no protection by this religious discrimination bill for a reasonable statement of faith. So there are many things it doesn't protect, and the removal of the clause that is commonly called the Folau clause, and that's a clause that protects reasonable statements of belief outside work, doesn't protect you inside work, shows that there's just been a real tepid appetite from the government to actually deal with the problems that face Christians on a day-to-day basis.
Right, yeah. So the bill kind of attempts to protect Christians within secular organisations, as well as protecting religious organisations and schools and things like that. So there's a dual thing. There's been talk of basically it provides a shield, but it also supposedly provides a sword. Now, what do you say to those critics that say it gives a sword to Christians, and do you think that's accurate?
Shield and sword language is really unhelpful, because it doesn't really give a shield to anything. If you are mistreated by someone unfairly, you still have to take legal action against the person who has mistreated you. You're going to have to take a discrimination claim. And the way the bill has been drafted is rather uninspiring, and it's going to mean that claims are difficult to take, will be long and costly, and involve multiple experts if you're going to run them properly. So that's one thing. The other thing is that where they talk about swords, the things that they're calling swords are just the normal balancing clauses that you have in every single discrimination law. So the ability of Christian schools to preference other people of their own faith is quite a reasonable proposition. And what it's saying is that we don't want a Buddhist taking legal action against a Roman Catholic school because they weren't given a job because they're of a different religion and can't adhere to the faith that the school is based on. You have that in all sorts of discrimination laws, and it's one that is particularly appropriate for a religious discrimination bill. It allows religious organizations to preserve their own religion. A lot of the opposition to that has been just scaremongering and pure dealing with ridiculous hypotheticals that suggest that it's going to be used to target people for other attributes. All of those are covered in the Sex Discrimination Act and have nothing to do with this bill. There's so many complex things going on at the moment. Like there's a few things that have also been removed. Protection for health practitioners, for example, that in a secular institute that they want to decline to offer or give a referral for certain procedures that would offend religious beliefs, like whether it's abortion, euthanasia, and other things like that, which is going to be particularly important as euthanasia is legalized more and more broadly in many states. I've just noticed today that Craig Kelly actually wants to reintroduce that amendment.
But so these things are becoming complicated and need to be examined. And Kelly made an excellent point that we're rushing this discussion through, and we only have very few minutes today left in terms of the lower house debate, and it looks like it's going to be debated again next February. We're going to have 3 different kind of ongoing investigations happening. We've got a Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee meeting and reporting on the February the 4th. We're going to have at least 3 different open consultation processes, 3 different days, and a government-backed inquiry, a joint parliamentary committee on human rights will report on February 4th as well. So we need to go through the proper process here. How can we as Christians participate in that process? And what do you think in terms of the speed at which the discussion is happening? We know that we want something before the next election because we don't know what the outcome is going to be, but we don't want to rush either and end up with something that's worse, which this Section 38(3), if this is removed, may end up being a lot worse for many religious schools.
That's correct. My gut feeling, I haven't worked through it all, is that if a deal has been struck and Sex Discrimination Act changes have been agreed in a way that really rips the heart out of protections in the Sex Discrimination Act, it just simply would be a bridge too far to advocate to people that they should support this religious discrimination bill. You're going to come out the back end of it much worse off than you went in. In terms of improvements to the religious discrimination bill, when it comes to bills that relate to issues of faith, they never get sort of advocated up in committee. They almost just have the knife applied to them and get whittled down. There are some key things that are missing from this bill. There's about 5 aspects in which it is less protective than other federal discrimination bills. Doesn't give the same level of protection, gives far less. Again, no one's been discussing those. Everyone has been concentrating on the tail of the dog, and that's been totally wagging the dog on this discussion. Even the Prime Minister himself had to spend significant time in his speech assuring everyone that no one was going to be able to expel gay students or fire gay teachers, which is kind of insulting to have that rammed into a otherwise very fine speech about how religious belief and activity, religious freedom needs to be protected. So the complete preoccupation with those issues has meant that we've missed several key issues of the bill that need to be protected.
And what are those issues? Just if you can quickly outline them.
A lot of them are fairly boring technical issues with the engine room of the bill dealing with discrimination. One of the key ones is that in every other act, if someone says, sure, I'm being discriminatory, but what I'm doing is reasonable. You know, it's reasonable for me not to let my religious employee take a half an hour break every hour to pray, right? That would be the kind of thing that would certainly be treating someone differently on the basis of their religion, but it would be reasonable. Everyone would say, yeah, that's reasonable. Now, in every other case where you prove discrimination and the discriminator says, I think it's reasonable, they are the ones who have to prove it. They're the ones who have to show that what they are, the condition they're imposing is indeed reasonable. In the religious discrimination bill, that's not the case. Not only do you as a religious person have to prove that you've been discriminated against, you also have to prove that it wasn't reasonable. And so that adds an extra burden. You've already got a difficult task ahead of you. And that's where it's different than every single other federal act. And no one is talking about that.
Yeah, of course, the other procedural matter, of course, too, is it seems evident that because this is a federal bill, you won't be able to take this through a state administrative tribunal, and unless the case is brought against you, if you want to pursue it and you've been discriminated against, you have to go into the civil court, and it's a tremendously costly process to bring about something. So will this operate at the state administrative tribunal level? Is that right?
Through human rights, the Australian Human Rights Commission at first instance.
Yeah.
And then it would go through the Australian Administrative Tribunal, so the federal tribunal system before it would go to the local courts is my understanding of it. So that shouldn't be too much of an issue. There are other issues with the bill. Every other bill says this is to be interpreted in accordance with the standards of international documents, such as the Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Interestingly, this one doesn't, because it's giving a level of protection that falls far short of international covenants. So it really is quite an unremarkable bill, but you wouldn't know that by all of the shouting in opposition that you're seeing on all sides.
Right. I want to turn to quickly then the new clauses that have been added that protect religious schools, and also the statement of belief clauses.
Yep.
What do you think is going to be the actual practical application for those for Christian schools and for Christian teachers in particular?
Sure. The intent of those is to give a federal standard, a national standard across all states and territories for the way that Christian schools can ensure that their ethos is protected and upheld by hiring teachers which can confess and live by that ethos. Because if you're a Christian school and you're trying to form children in a particular religion, which is the right of the parents who send their kids to that school, it really is going to be detrimental if you have someone who's indifferent to or absolutely hostile to the ethos of that school. Even if you compel them to pay lip service to whatever the ethos of the school is, it's not going to work out well. It's best for both school and teacher who has different view to not be having to be forced into that situation. There are plenty of schools for people who have views that are different than those of religious schools, plenty of employment opportunities. The problem is that the rules are different in each state and territory, and this would bring some reasonable standard of similarity, or it would impose the same standard across all of the country. And the key issue will be very clear: schools can preference people of their own religion when they're hiring, and that in itself is not discrimination. That's it. That's reasonable. Yep. Now, to the extent that a state would pass a law that is inconsistent, and again, inconsistent only on this point of what religion your employees can or can't be, then there's a power of the government to be able to introduce regulations naming that particular piece of legislation and effectively overriding it with the standard that's established in the Religious Discrimination Bill. It's going to be a really hard process, because you're going to have a government that is actually willing to override a piece of state legislation. They'll have to introduce regulations. Then they'll have to get through the disallowance procedure that is in the Senate. And if you've got a Senate like we do now, which is completely divided and is very easily able to stymie and kibosh government regulations, then you just got no hope. So it's really it does give some protection. I mean, it's better than nothing, but it's by no means the overarching and overruling provision that some of the critics say it is.
Yeah, as Shamar comments here, we were assured that same-sex marriage would not affect anybody else. And is there some way we can hold these politicians accountable? And obviously, we're fast approaching a federal election as early as May next year. So obviously, we'll see something in terms of we can respond at the ballot box. We can obviously write to these particular politicians that are making these deals, and most particularly to Morrison and to Macaulay-Cash, and say, what is your reasons? And we don't believe that these reasons are, of course, at all justified. So yes. What were your top points would be to holding politicians accountable as we come up to election?
Well, I think there's needs to be every single lobbying organisation needs to be actively involved. There needs to be a sharing of resources and a common understanding, and not the usual sort of infighting and patch protection that we've often seen when there's been lobbying on these things. We need to be going to our local member and explaining to them that people of religion are a significant part of the electorate, and that they are largely politically homeless now. As between Liberal and Labor Party, no one is really speaking the language of toleration and keeping spaces open for the religious. Almost all of them are getting onto a bandwagon of progressivism, which is a religion that's completely intolerant of Christianity and other faiths. So the other thing is to be bringing to the attention of these politicians the real cases of Australians who are facing hostility. We've got a website called australiawatch.com.au. That documents over 46 cases of religious discrimination in Australia, of religious freedom cases. We've put together a flyer with 5 particular cases that we think could be helped by this bill. We've also seen a flyer from the Institute for Civil Society, our good friend Mark Snedden in Melbourne, who's put together the 5 key objections and the debunking of the myths in those objections that have been run in the media about this bill. People should get their hands on that, and they should use it with their local politician. And then get on board with the campaigns that are being run by Family Voice, by Eternity News, by the Australian Christian Lobby, by Canberra Declaration. There's a bunch of organisations who are advocating on these particular points. They need to make their voices heard. But unfortunately, I think a lot of our lobbying has been rather weak-kneed on these issues. We've always given these politicians our lunch money and hoped that they'll be our friend, and they've actually just ended up time and time again slamming us against the lockers again. And then we come back the next day, and what do? We give them our lunch money.
Yeah. It'd be nice. Unfortunately, some of the talk was like, we definitely don't expel gay students, and there was no enunciation of the key difference between orientation, behaviour, and the fact that behaviour itself can be linked to the particular attraction or orientation, and we need to be carefully articulating the differences and the nuances of that without buying into the way the media and secular intolerant people characterize that.
Absolutely. We've allowed ourselves to use their language, to fall into this language of tolerance, diversity, and inclusion, which actually means intolerance, uniformity, and exclusion. And we're basically playing the game by their rules on a tilted field that they've tilted against us. We need to be more involved in setting the parameters, in showing how awesome our Christian communities are. The reason why people who are same-sex attracted flock to Christian schools is because they're places where standards are upheld, bullying isn't allowed. They don't allow you to get involved in this rampant individualism and preoccupation with hedonism and sex that's encouraged at other schools and is portrayed as a virtue, when it's actually killing our kids and giving them mental health issues beyond what is acceptable. It's just a conversation we need to have, showing just how good and better our schools are, and that's why 1 in 3 parents want to send their kids there.
Yeah, that's right. And we have an articulation of that. This is for the benefit of everybody. Like the fact that we can have competing reasonable ideologies in different schools. Let the parents make the choice. Why is it that we have to have this church and state union where the state tells the church this is how and what you behave, and there can be no actual appropriate broad disagreement about these key matters? And we should have freedom of speech, we should have freedom of thought and freedom of association, and these are essential goods for society as well as for Christian schooling and for schooling in general. And that intolerance obviously just will not bear the fact that some people will disagree for good reasons, and we're seeing parents and teachers and bearing the brunt of that. And the most egregious parts of the fact is that when a student comes into a school and the parents want to coerce the school into giving in to whatever this young child desires for their life, and the school is saying, no, we don't agree with that, the school needs to articulate to those parents to say, look, you'd be better provided for at another place, another organisation that actually meets your particular expectations for schooling. we have this group of 1,000 or more parents in this school that have decided this is the way we want to operate, and that should be reasonable in a free society.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, you will have people who are completely unreligious who want to put their children in a school who are vulnerable to safeguard them from the aggressive pepper spraying by activists that they get in the sex education curriculum, in the diversity and tolerance training in other schools. I've talked to countless parents who have no faith, but whose children are being seduced by this ideology at schools. And they say, where can I go to where my child isn't going to be told you can choose to be a boy or a girl at 4 years old, 5 years old? And my advice has always been, take them to a Christian school which operates in accordance with the teachings of the Bible on these things, where there'll be a safe haven away from that constant battery by these ideas. But clearly the kinds of moves we're seeing aligned with this religious discrimination bill and the complaints that are being raised by the so-called moderate liberals are going to increasingly close the sphere of what's possible, and are going to leave our schools vulnerable if they stay on mission and do what they've been set up to do.
And therefore, it also won't be possible to actually compare different groups and say, here's a control group, here's another group, and let's compare the outcomes for these particular children over time. It won't be possible to even know.
We know a lot of that already, but false narratives have been dominating this whole discussion since the issue of gender with children arose. None of it has a great evidence base, and yet it's being forced on everybody.
Yeah. So. Yeah, but I wasn't talking about the general research that's already happened on gender and sexuality matters. I'm talking about just the fact that society itself and what everyone thinks as normal will evolve so quickly when no one's allowed to disagree. Everyone has to agree to a certain set of religious tenets that the state determines are good and determines we're going to control what's positive and what's good. And we're not going to simply limit government to what's negative and harmful. We're going to say you can only proclaim these positive things and you're not allowed to say anything else, any other choice for these positive behaviours.
Yes.
So that's where I would say that the liberal people on the liberal side and moderates and stuff, like, they have this idea that government has a responsibility to institute that which is positive behaviour, when the biblical prescription for government is simply to punish the evil doer, the evil against, and in some limited sections reward good. But that's where marriage would be rewarding a good behaviour. But in terms of so that's where I think that politics has evolved to becoming more and more of a religious-based ideology that's imposed upon everybody.
Well, everything's become political, Darryl.
Yeah.
So there's less and less areas of your life which are not political and thus not subject to political pressures and control. And I don't think that's a good thing. It's really hard to determine how Christians should engage in a environment where that is happening. Ideally, you wouldn't want to create more laws like we are on discrimination and on vilification, and to encourage this victim mentality that has arisen because of this. But it is the milieu in which we are traveling. It's the spirit of the age in which we're engaged, that you almost always deal with these things through legislation. We talk about shields. Instead of a shield, ideally, I would have liked to have just seen some of the swords that are pointed at religion slightly turned away or blunted or changed to restore a little bit of balance by having less law. But that's just never going to happen. So really, a religious discrimination bill seems to be one of the reasonable ways of making incremental change to bring back some balance. But the amount of opposition we've had to something very unremarkable is, quite frankly, astounding.
Reflects their religious point of view. So in terms of wrapping up, then we're going to see that we're going to have about 10 days of lower house discussion next year. So that means it will probably pass through the lower house, and then we maybe have 5 days, maybe 8 days in total in the upper house next year before the election comes. So we have very limited time. So until those things happen, we've got a couple of committees that will soon issue how to submit to this committee. All of our organisation will be informing every one of you about how to put in a submission to these committees and articulate your point of view, obviously pro-freedom religious choice. And then in addition to that, obviously, we need to have discussions directly with our MPs and meet with them. You're looking at the clock, so I think we're going to wrap up very soon. Just a final word, John?
Sure. Look, this is something where it's really a moving feast. We're not sure exactly what's going to come out of this process and whether or not we're going to get anything useful before the election is done. But if you're a Christian, you know that whatever the outcome, God's in control. We've read the last page and we know who wins. So we get involved. We try to do so in ways that are useful. We don't engage in the enemy's tactics of scaremongering, of putting on political pressure. We just stand for truth and speak the truth in love and deal with those who are opposition, knowing that they are miserable people for not knowing the gospel. That our battle is not against flesh and blood, against powers and principalities of the air. It's a spiritual battle, and it's not going to be won politically. If we want to change society, we spread the gospel. What we do just hopefully leave some room for people to still be able to do that in a pluralistic society, which really gives some room for Christian voice in the public square. So there's reason to be encouraged. Sometimes these things can end on a discouraging note. I'm never discouraged. I'm always a realist, but never discouraged.
That's good. I enjoy your friendship, John, and thanks for those encouraging words. That's right. Absolutely, we're loving and compassionate for all and want to see people come to know Christ personally through all of what we say and articulate. Obviously, we want to share that love with those people and with anybody who is enemy or a friend. We want to bring them to see Christ as their friend and who wants to save them and redeem them for everything that they've ever done against God's law. So thanks for your time today, John, and we'll wrap it up there, and we'll maybe speak to you again another time. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Join us again next time we have a special broadcast. Thanks.
Thanks, Darryl. See you later.
See ya.